to Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. Things continue to move quickly in Ottawa. Mark Carney cruised easily to victory in the Liberal leadership race and is now Prime Minister. And Liberals continue to surge in the polls, and we could be in a federal election campaign as early as next week. U.S. President Donald Trump also continues to threaten Canada with tariffs and annexation. And joining us today to talk about it all and where Indigenous issues fit in is Veldon Coburn, who is an associate professor and part of the Indigenous Relations Initiative at McGill University. Welcome back to Nation Nation, Veldon.
Thanks, Fraser. It's a pleasure.
All right, so I guess first off, there's all this talk now this week about election. It might be called on Sunday. That's the latest I'm hearing. But the House is supposed to resume on March 24th, but is it safe to say that that's likely will not happen?
Yeah, well, when Prime Minister or then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau prorogued Parliament, his political fortunes didn't look very good, and the place of the Liberal Party as forming a government at that particular time looked very dire. But since then, we've seen reversals in the polls that show for the first time, perhaps in 5 years, the possibility of a Liberal majority. There's a reinvigoration behind the new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, that maybe plans have changed and that the House may not resume, and that instead they will visit, or Prime Minister Carney will visit the Governor General and call an election. So that may precede even the Parliament sitting again.
Okay, I want to move now to how the Liberals may fare in this election. Now, of course, they were kind of dead in the water a few months ago. Things didn't look good. They were losing by-elections and safe seats, and Trudeau was there. He was polling badly. They were as much as 20 points behind. But now you have this surge. It's been really, with the Trump tariffs, all that stuff. And Carney, they've been surging. Do you think, though, could the Liberals actually pull off a fourth election victory?
It seems quite possible now. So just as a political scientist who studies these kind of things, many of my colleagues have remarked that this is unprecedented in terms of the reversal again, that 2 months ago at the beginning of January, it looked like there was going to be an overwhelming Conservative majority led by Pierre Poilievre. But the polls have sharply reversed in recent weeks, and in the last couple of days, most polling firms have showed that the odds of a Conservative government are now really in low double digits, maybe 10 to 15%. But that for the first time, again, it's quite possible that it'll be a Liberal majority. So things really changed in a way that we wouldn't have predicted in early January till now. That we could be seeing a Liberal majority headed by an elected Mark Carney as leading the government as Prime Minister.
Yeah, I guess that's so. You think that's even people are saying that that might be a bit far, but you think that if they get on a roll, and the things go well for the Liberals, like in a campaign, that they could actually get another majority.
It's possible, but sometimes campaign periods too, things can change as well. May not be too drastic because, well, as we know, back in 2015, Justin Trudeau and the Liberals sat in third place, and it seemed to be that, perhaps then Tom Mulcair might surge ahead of Stephen Harper and the Conservatives at that point. But then it was such a long campaign period, even 10 years ago, if our memory serves, that it was, probably, I think, the longest writ period as it might have been. So it allowed for a lot of errors and horse trading and, moving ahead of one another too. But it seems at this point that there is so much momentum behind the Liberals. I think there's a great backlash against the Conservatives and Pierre Poilievre is that he had pandered too much to American politics, which is detrimental to the larger Canadian population. But for Indigenous peoples too, we have a foreign power threatening to annex what is our territories too. So the threat may be broad to Canada, but we feel it ourselves as well too. And we see on that end of the political spectrum is that perhaps people are very afraid of what that might bring if we have a right-wing government that is aligned with a right-wing United States.
Yeah, I might actually switch to a question that I had a little further down, but are you seeing any negatives maybe a bit? There's this big pressure for Canada now because of our reliance on energy contracts in the United States and energy from there to establish Canada as an energy leader and a sovereign energy leader, which means there's a lot of talk about getting pipelines going again for oil and gas. First Nations, of course, play a role in this, but do you see a lot of pressure coming on to First Nations to, as this rallying cry to be patriotic and, to sort of, not stand in the way of this sort of pipeline progress, which is suddenly reared its head again?
Right. So, where there are Indigenous nations that are still asserting their sovereignty over their territory or who are defending their treaty rights to resources that are within their territory, we've seen a few sort of conservative announcements. And just in the last day, Pierre Poilievre says, well, we are going to develop the Ring of Fire, which has been contentious because it lies within First Nations treaty territory, of which there are nation-to-nation relationships. It seems that they want to run roughshod over First Nations in the quest of defending Canada against our neighbors to the south, to, I guess, advance our independence a little bit more, because we've been shipping for a great deal a lot of our natural resources to the United States, including oil and gas, for their consumption, their processing consumption. But First Nations have a hand to play in this game too. So in Ontario, again, Doug Ford as well has gestured towards the development of the Ring of Fire because of battery technology and the critical minerals that lie within the ground there. Is that he said just recently, take us to court. Enough is enough. We're going in to do it. So they're going to do it and ask for forgiveness after rather than ask for permission first. But it's the wrong approach.
Okay, well, we'll have to end it there. But as always, thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
Up next, we'll talk to another academic, Yukon University Professor Ken Coates, about Canada's refocus on becoming an energy leader and what role Indigenous communities may play. Welcome back. U.S. President Donald Trump's continued threats to annex and impose tariffs on Canada has shifted the discussion about energy production in this country to pipeline construction from north to south to east to west, which would make Canada less reliant on American energy and more able to export our oil and gas to foreign markets. In the past, First Nations have been both for and against energy pipelines running through their territories. And joining us today to talk about this is Yukon University Professor Ken Coates. He joins me from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Welcome back to Nation, Professor Coates.
Great to be with you.
All right, so let's start off with these pipeline projects. I know you've covered them over the years. Kind of got stalled, I guess, after the Liberals took office in 2015. What do you see changing in the coming months, regardless of who forms the next government?
Well, the Liberals have announced very major changes in their policies. All of a sudden, they love pipelines. And before they don't, they've realized that pipelines are fundamental to the economic success of Canada. We've burdened ourselves unnecessarily with a huge loss of revenue over the last number of years because of pipelines. And so one thing is the the federal government's no longer to be an impediment. Whether it's the Liberals or the Conservatives, pipelines will be a sort of a good thing. The second thing is that Aboriginal people will be at the forefront. If you go back 10 years, 15 years, they were at best an afterthought, and sometimes they were ignored entirely. And so there was always being, Indigenous people are in the way. They're protesting, they're oppositional or whatever. And we saw this with the Wet'suwet'en people in British Columbia. They were strongly opposed to certain projects, the Coastal Gas Pipeline generally. If you actually look at the Trans Mountain Pipeline, it actually went ahead very, very nicely. There were lots of agreements. There were some people protesting, a lot of non-Aboriginal people protesting as well. But the other one, we did an expansion of Line 3, which goes from Alberta, goes into Ontario. You never heard about that. And if you actually followed on the ground, the pipeline companies had good relationships with First Nations and Métis communities. They talked to them ahead of time. They worked out collaborative agreements, and it worked fairly quickly. Now we have a situation kind of radically different, where Indigenous people may well be the owners and proponents of some of these pipelines. The Nisga'a, for example, are planning on an LNG project based in their territory, which is on the northern coast, north of Prince Rupert, British Columbia. It would require a pipeline that sort of runs a bit parallel to the Coastal GasLink pipeline that would go all the way across through Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en territory. So there'd be possibility of some conflict there again. But these are Indigenous people who want to propose the pipelines and propose the LNG projects and run the shipping as well. We have the same thing in the Kitimat area with Cedar LNG, which is actually owned by the Haisla.
Now, with all this kind of, obviously, it's really shifted things of having energy independence from the United States. And governments, both provincial, of course, and you mentioned the federal government really focusing on some of these projects. But at the same time, do you think with all this rush, there may be sort of a tendency for companies and governments to sort of bypass their duty to consult obligations with First Nations?
So I absolutely hope not. Completely hope not, because if they haven't learned anything at all in the last 20 years, it is that you do not get projects going without sort of full Indigenous participation. They've also discovered in many instances that Indigenous people are active proponents and are active participants and are willing to support the projects as they go along. If you look at the Indian Resource Council, for example, the representing oil producing companies in Western Canada, they're very actively involved in proposing and promoting these kind of collaborations. I think it's probably fair to say we will not get significant oil and natural gas pipelines developed without not even just First Nations the duty to consult. It actually has to be involvement and engagement. So, for example, they're developing some proposals to take natural gas and maybe even bitumen to Port Churchill, which is on Hudson Bay. Goes through enormous amounts of Indigenous territory, First Nations and Métis territory, from Manitoba all the way to the coast of Hudson Bay. It could be a huge economic driver in the region. It could bring long-term royalty revenues and benefits and all that kind of stuff. But it will interfere with Indigenous lands, and folks in those areas are very sensitive because they went through the flooding that occurred in the big hydro development projects. That will not happen without Indigenous involvement. And quite frankly, it won't happen without Indigenous ownership. Not necessarily 100% ownership, but a significant equity sort of position. We learned that in the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Project when the Mackenzie Valley First Nations communities were going to own 30% of the Mackenzie Valley Project. It collapsed for reasons of market and whatever. And the First Nations were devastated by that. They had actually found a way to sort of sustain themselves in their community in a way they were comfortable and willing to see go forward through collaboration with a pipeline project. They were devastated when it collapsed because they lost the income that was going to actually protect people in their place. So maybe, I think we learned how to do it better. I think the global markets will respond very well to projects that are supported by Indigenous communities, part owned by Indigenous communities. The Japanese, the Germans, the French, the Brits will all be much happier to buy things when they have full involvement and full consensus.
So I just wanted to turn briefly to sort of politics here in Ottawa. Of course, there's the new Liberal leader and Prime Minister Mark Carney. And if you followed the Liberal leadership race, really, there was not a lot of discussion about reconciliation or Indigenous issues after the government under Trudeau had made that a focus for his tenure. What role do you think in a future government, either Conservative or Liberal, will reconciliation play?
So I think Indigenous communities are nervous. We've had a run with the Liberal Party where they're really, really good at spending money. We had a tripling in the amount of the budgets for Indigenous affairs in this country. We had tens of millions of dollars in compensation agreements that were quite frankly rushed out the door in the last year through a whole bunch of negotiated and court-related settlements. It's not going to stay that way, and it's not going to get much better. I don't imagine in the next little while. And I think Indigenous communities are sort of nervous about that, and they should be, because they have a lot riding on that relationship with the government of Canada. I think if the Conservatives are elected in the following election, you'll see a shift toward economic development. They'll provide more money or as much money, but it'll be basically tied to whether the communities are going to support major projects. So, for example, if I was in the Ring of Fire, if you had a Conservative government, they would be basically saying, you want anything from us, you're going to have to agree to do some of the mining activity. I don't like that kind of, the danger associated with that and the kind of casual threats that might be associated with that. But on the other hand, the Canadian people expect some sort of quid pro quo for the funding that they're providing.
Right, yeah, so you're basically saying there you might see more focus there than the previous government on some of these things. Yeah,
so very much.
Good assessment. Yeah, so we'll have to leave it there, unfortunately, but as always, thanks for talking to us, and keep in touch.
Anytime. Take care.
Up next, we'll talk to Green Party leader Elizabeth May about two recent federal court decisions on a proposed nuclear waste dump at Chalk River, and the renewed focus on energy pipelines. Welcome back. U.S. President Donald Trump's continued annexation and tariff threats that change everything in this country. This includes climate change policy. The first thing Mark Carney did when he became Prime Minister last week was to promise to scrap the consumer carbon levy. There's also a renewed focus on Canadian energy and sovereignty. And for many, this means building pipelines east and west in order for oil and gas producers to reach foreign markets more easily. Joining me today to talk about the latest is Green Party leader Elizabeth May. She joins me from Kitchener, Ontario. Well, welcome back to Nation, Miss May.
Thank you so much, Fraser. Great to be with you.
So I was going to go back for a second to an issue you know really well, and that's the two recent federal court decisions on the proposed Chalk River nuclear waste dump, which went in favor, of course, of the Quebec First Nation, which was one of the groups that had brought these forward. What do you think this means for this sort of contentious site now going forward that clearly Chalk River wants to build, but there's problems there?
Well, a huge miigwech to Chief Lance Heyman and the other Algonquin nations. Quebec took it forward for standing up for UNDRIP, for saying this really matters. You don't get to say this is important and we didn't have time for adequate consultation. I mean, so for the Federal Court of Appeal has, or rather, the Federal Court has at least granted part of what the challenge was here, and the challenge was inadequate consultation to place radioactive waste, what they call near surface, to accommodate Canadian nuclear laboratories on Chalk River. I find it astonishing that Canadians in general don't know that the nuclear establishment in this country and its assets were for the most part bought up when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister by what used to be called SNC-Lavalin. We remember SNC-Lavalin for the scandal that took out our wonderful Minister of Justice, Jody Wilson-Raybould. But SNC-Lavalin is now the name behind Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. It's the main shareholder. So that's who the Quebec First Nation is up against. Now disguised under multiple layers of name changes as Atkins Realis. The decision that it doesn't matter to put radioactive waste near the Ottawa River at basically near surface, and that's all okay. And these Indigenous nations should just go away. Thank heavens there was a good court decision. And I think what it means, I hope it means for government, federal government, the boosters of the nuclear industry within the federal government need to stop and take stock. And it also applies to Pierre Poilievre jumping the gun and saying Ring of Fire should all be approved right away. We don't need to wait and talk to Indigenous nations. This is a wake up to the orders of government, the political parties that think, and the industry, back to SNC-Lavalin, that thinks they can run roughshod over Indigenous concerns.
Do you think, though, based on these two decisions, it's really this proximity, closeness of the Ottawa River that they will have to, Canadian nuclear laboratories will have to change the site?
I would hope, well, look, what the court rules, unfortunately, isn't as strong as you have to change the site. The court ruling is you haven't lived up to constitutional requirements of the Government of Canada under Section 35 of the Constitution and UNDRIP, and you've got to do that. I hope it means looking at the site again and saying, is it really wise to put this so close to the Ottawa River? We've had contamination in the Ottawa River. If we could measure the tritium, we know we've had contamination from Chalk River into the Ottawa River for a long time. And this it stands increases the risk substantially to be storing nuclear waste, not high-level nuclear waste, but still radioactive materials stored near the Ottawa River. And I think I really hope that it's a message to the industry, but also to government, to tell the industry that that's not a good place to store the waste.
Fair enough. And so I thought I might turn now to sort of just general climate change policy. I'm sure you have noticed that as the closer we get to this election, the less that the Liberals and NDP are talking about any sort of climate change policy, and certainly not any climate change penalties anymore. And we kind of know where the Conservatives stand already. What do you think this means for climate change going forward, and how it's might be talked about in the upcoming election?
Well, as you can imagine, Greens don't run away from hard issues, and we don't decide what issues we are putting in our platform based on, putting our finger to the wind and seeing which way the polls are blowing. We stay with the evidence. We know that the climate crisis is an enormous threat to this country. We know we've experienced it, and a lot of Indigenous nations have experienced the devastation of wildfires and of extreme weather events and heat domes and Hurricane Fiona on our East Coast. I mean, these are killer events, and we know what causes them, burning fossil fuels. So yeah, we're going to keep talking about climate policy as well. Not just we have to reduce our emissions. We also have to be with a civil defense. We have to be prepared. And a lot of Indigenous nations have more experience on how to organize, save lives, and respond to be resilient at the community level to protect lives. We'll keep talking about that. Now, Mark Carney, our new prime minister, first act was to get rid of the consumer carbon levy, but at least he has said there will be something more that he'll do, and he'll keep the carbon price on big polluters. Mr. Poilievre said he'll take away any price on polluters as well. It is important, I think, that the Canadian public and Indigenous nations continue to push to know, what are you really saying you're going to do about climate to each of the parties. Don't let us off the hook either. Everybody needs to be clear what they think is at stake, why we have to take these actions now to protect Mother Earth. We don't have another planet to go to, although fortunately Donald Trump and Elon Musk think they can go to Mars. I'd urge them to pack now and leave so we can take care of planet Earth and they can see that there's no life on Mars. We have to protect the only planet that has life, that sustains our life, and that's Mother Earth. And we'll keep talking about it and demanding the others show us what they plan to do. We know what they want to do. They just like 3-word slogans: axe the tax. Maybe we could save old growth forests if we could tax the axe
That's
enough to stop
right.
the logging
Right.
of our, like Fairy Creek, where Indigenous land defenders like our deputy leader Rainbow is still facing jail time. It's incredible to me that the real criminals, the international fossil fuel, big oil, the ringleaders of all this, the Exxons and the Mobils and the Imperial Oils, all of them are basically a form of organized crime. They know they're stealing our children's future and they don't care. And governments that stand back and say, well, it's good for the economy, so I guess we can apologize to future generations later. That doesn't wash. If you're not planning for the 7th generation, you're not planning with any kind of moral compass.
Exactly. Well said. Okay, well, we'll have to end it there, but as always, thanks very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Miigwech.
That concludes this week's episode of Nation. If you missed any parts of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night.